I'm Emily Weiler with the Montana Public Health Training Center. I'm here with our training coordinator, Amy Elliott. We will be here for the entirety of the training, as always. So we're here to keep track of the chat box to make sure that no questions get missed. If you have any technical difficulties, feel free to reach out to us. But we'll be here to be of assistance. If you get kicked out for any reason, bad internet or something, no worries. Just click on that link and we'll let you right back in. And other than that, I think we're good to go. So I will turn it over to Ivy Anderson and Alexa Clark to start our Trauma 101 training today. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Yeah, my name's Ivy Anderson. I'm here with my colleague, Alexa Clark. We actually work at the Parenting Place. Here, I'll share my.
Is Ivy frozen for anybody else? She's frozen for me.
She just froze for me too.
Yeah.
Hopefully she comes back around in a minute. This happened yesterday too, so we lost her.
Ivy!
Come back. That's okay. Folks are still coming in, so
yeah, true.
So it works out okay. Oh, technology. Oh, did she leave us completely?
I think she got kicked off.
She did. Okay, well, wait till our one of our trainers comes back. I need to come up with some jokes or some stand-up or something.
Yeah,
for these moments.
Need some Irish limericks for tomorrow.
I do, yes. I should tell you, I'm so excited. So my gramophone from the 1920s is my favorite antique, and it came with a Bing Crosby shellac record of When Irish Eyes Are Smiling, and it's beautiful, and I will make sure to listen to that tomorrow.
I like your little decor behind you, Emily, your St. Patrick's decor.
Always. Yep, it changes with the season.
Yes.
This is what
I apologize in advance. They're doing construction right across the street from my apartment. So I've been listening to drills and horns and everything all morning. So I apologize if that makes it difficult to hear me, everyone.
So far, so good. That's always frustrating though. There's a lot of construction happening in town and on campus right now. So
right.
It's gotten kind of messy.
I've lived here for 3 years, and I think some of it has been going on for the entire time I've lived here.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, no, that sounds about right though.
Let's see. Should I share my screen, do you think? Or I hope we get her. Maybe I'll text her.
Yeah, maybe
Ivy.
You can text her and make sure.
She said my internet crashed. I'm resetting it and we'll be right back.
Okay, good. All right. It's only 10:05. We started a little earlier than I normally even do. So I think we're good. So everyone just hang in there.
Yeah.
Again, for new ones that just popped on, welcome. We'll get started here in a second when our other trainer comes back.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for being here. And we're really excited we've done this training once for all the newcomers. And so this is a repeat, but we're very excited.
Yeah, I'm so glad we could do this again. I think the majority of you are from Colorado. So welcome.
Yeah.
It's exciting to have you. We love out-of-staters.
Mm-hmm.
No problem, Ben.
Mm-hmm. And again, feel free to use the chat. I know Emily and Amy are going to be keeping an eye on it, but I will also try to be mindful about it. And I don't want any questions to go unmissed or go missed.
Go missed?
Yeah.
Unanswered, I think is.
Yes, that's what I meant.
For sure. And of course, we love it when folks are engaged. This can be a heavy topic, but we really, it's a nice, warm, safe space for lots of good discussion and questions. And
I know I speak for Ivy as well, but it's a lot more fun for us and engaging for us when people do ask questions and bring discussion to the table. So please don't hesitate.
Awesome.
This just in, ladies, it is officially snowing.
Is it? Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I thought so.
Okay, well, I will stop talking
Hey,
about
Ivy.
spring.
I finally got to the south side from you, Alexa.
Yeah, I'm in downtown, so
There you go.
Oh, you're
Ivy, you're
muted,
muted.
Ivy.
All
There we
right, there we go. Gosh, I'm so sorry, everybody. Apologies. My internet just crashed, of course, when Emily's talking about if you have any technical difficulties.
Right, and then she left.
So
we'll make-
I will go ahead and share my screen. Can you,
Amy? Yeah, make her co-host, please.
there we go.
Yay.
Okay. So let me get my presentation up here for you guys. Oh, everybody gets to see my screensaver here.
your elephants.
So let's see. Oh, I got to move this out of the way so I can actually get to it. Okay.
There we
So
go.
I was just talking away and then realized everybody else was frozen except for me. So I'll just start again. But yeah, welcome everybody. My name's Ivy Anderson. I'm here with my colleague, Alexa Clark, and we work at the Parenting Place. It's a little nonprofit child abuse prevention center here in Missoula, Montana. And the work that we do is basically teaching parenting classes. We teach them in the community and at the jail and the pre-release center here. And we also give these trauma and ACE presentations. So this one you're seeing today is a 4-hour presentation. We're, as you know, breaking it up into 2 different weeks. And a lot of this information was given to us by the Trauma Institute out of Buffalo, New York. So this is their little logo down here. We wanted to give them some credit for that. But yeah, I guess I'm just kind of wondering if people want to put in the chat, like what your role is, what your job title is, that might kind of help us out, and maybe how much you know about trauma and ACEs, if this is like your first time hearing about it, or if you already received education around ACEs and trauma. That's always helpful so that I don't over explain when we get to the ACE study if people have already heard about it. So yeah, I'm not seeing anything in the chat yet.
COVID investigator,
Oh, great.
COVID, a lot of people work with COVID.
Well, I won't make everybody share in there. I just wanted, to know a little bit about you guys. But we can get rolling here. But before we begin, I always like to remind people that it's Alexa and I's, role today to protect everybody's emotional safety, because when we're talking about trauma, it can feel really heavy and bring up things for people. So it's not that we don't want people to share experiences that they have gone through or learned about. We just ask that if you're going to share, to kind of use this analogy down here of like skipping the stone rather than sinking it and going into too many details that might, trigger others in the room. But also, because this is such a heavy topic, we are going to give you guys some breaks. I think we'll take a break at 11. But if during, any of this information that we're presenting today, you're feeling triggered, please, feel free to step away, get a glass of water, splash some water on your face and kind of reset, because we do know that this topic is a lot. So we appreciate you guys being here. I think this is important information. So yeah, just a little reminder there. Oop, this always happens. So I'm just going to ask that everybody just take a little moment here, kind of ground yourself, maybe take a nice big, deep breath, because again, this is a lot. So just taking notice of yourself and, how you're feeling with your heart today, what's going on with, your family and friends, and just acknowledging, what's happening in our communities and the world. I know that we are in another war, so that's going on. We also are still, trying to work our way out of a pandemic. We have, the Black Lives Matter movement is still going. We have, violence against Asian women that's still prominent. We also have the missing, murdered Indigenous peoples. So it's just, there's a lot happening in the world, and I just want everybody to, take a little space for that, honor what's going on. And again, I just appreciate everybody being here to discuss this important topic with us. So this is why we're here. We're talking about trauma. This is Trauma 101, and we're going to cover what it is, why it matters, and also how to be trauma informed. And not only trauma informed, but we hope everybody walks away feeling like they're more trauma responsive. So that just means that we know this information and we're putting it into action with our daily lives, with everybody that we come into contact with. Because as this quote here says, trauma is perhaps the most avoided, ignored, belittled, denied, misunderstood, and untreated cause of human suffering. And that's why we are discussing this today, because it's so common for people to, brush trauma under the rug or not have the words to talk about it. And it almost seems easier to, treat it that way. But when we don't talk about these things, there isn't a space for healing and nothing really changes. So that's why we at the Parenting Place are all about, spreading this information far and wide. And we hope that you guys, take what you learned today and share it. And I think everybody, I'm not sure if everybody got these slides. If not, I'll make sure that they're sent out to you. So we're going to begin just thinking about what we know about trauma already. Maybe you know a lot already. Maybe this is your first trauma training, and that's okay. I like to remind people that even people who consider themselves experts in trauma are still learning. This is like a lifelong learning process. There's always something new. So hopefully everybody walks away with some new information. So I'll turn this over to Alexa.
Do you want to do the clicking?
Yep.
So
I'll just put it all up here.
This, so our self and worldview is really impacted until we turn 10 years old. And these is also called our core beliefs, which are our sense of self, other, and the world as a whole, as it says up there. And this obviously can be very impacted by trauma. And some examples of core beliefs are, I'm not worthy of love, or other people are not safe, and I'm not good enough, or I have no self-worth. And these core beliefs, they don't just affect our childhood, they really affect our whole life. And they're very difficult to combat. And that's part of the reason we're here, to learn how to combat them and learn how to be sensitive to them. And yeah,
thanks, Alexa. I think, we start out with our, thinking about what it is that our worldview is, because everybody's life experience takes them to a different perspective about, is the world safe or not? And like Alexa said, that's kind of established by the time we're 10 years old. So it's not that we can never change those, create new neural pathways in our brains and things like that. But it's, again, if we don't understand this information, these kind of thoughts that we have, or that individuals that we work with have, it's hard to change them when we don't have a place to begin from.
And so the impacts of these core beliefs and this worldview can be felt, like it says, physically, emotionally, cognitively, behaviorally, and spiritually. And I like to think of this model like a train, because what you feel physically will also impact your emotions, and what you feel emotionally is going to impact your thoughts and your cognitive functions. And then what you think is going to impact your behaviors, and your behaviors will influence your spirituality. And so it's like a train. It starts and then it just keeps going and doesn't stop.
Yeah, all these things are just highly interconnected. So I'm not sure, I didn't read through the chat about how many people, if anybody answered, if they'd ever heard of the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. So I'll just give a brief background about it. Um, so if you've heard of ACEs, that's what it stands for, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And these two men here were the key investigators of this study. It was done out of California in the early to mid 90s. So it's old, right? But a lot of people haven't heard about it. And I think that's a problem because especially when we're in healthcare, we should know this information. So really the background behind it is that these two guys, Robert Anda was working for the CDC and Vincent Felitti was working for Kaiser Permanente. And if anybody's familiar with Kaiser, they're a huge health consortium, meaning that they own the hospitals, they own the research that's being conducted, they are in charge of like the health insurance companies. So that is how they were able to access these 17,000 participants. So they reference this as one of the largest public health studies of all time because of that number of people. So yeah, the reason they were able to access them is because they all had Kaiser insurance. So if you think about it, I mean, Kaiser has, pretty good insurance, right? It's not cheap. So that just tells us that the people involved in the study had enough money to afford this, right? And I point that out because a lot of the time we think that people who've experienced trauma are those people, on the other side of the tracks. And it's really not that way. It's common, it's this study involved, it was half men, half women, ages 18 up to 65. And what they did was, sat down and interviewed them, like a stack of questions. And what they found, a lot of the questions were about people's childhood. And they were able, because they had the insurance, they were able to access their health records. And what they found was that when people have experienced adversity or trauma or toxic stress, however you want to coin the term, early on in the first 18 years of our life, it can increase our risk for health problems later in life, like we saw in the last slide with the physical, mental, behavioral, cognitive, spiritual health. All of these things are affected by our life experiences. So I don't know if anybody's seen this before. It's what we call an ACE screener. Everybody who comes through the Parenting Place doors takes this survey. And it's really designed to help us understand somebody's life experience so that we can work with them. And also, I think it gives people the opportunity to open up and talk about these things if they've never been asked these questions. So these 10 questions were based on that huge stack, of questions I told you that they asked people. These were the 10 most common traumas that people said they had experienced in the first 18 years of life. So for time's sake, I won't read through all of them, but they broke these things down into 3 different areas. So it's, physical, sexual, emotional abuse, and then emotional or physical neglect, and then what they call household challenges. So, oftentimes when I ask people to fill this survey out, they're like, well, I've had people say things like, well, I, watched somebody, be shot right in front of me, or I was hospitalized as a child for 3 months. Like, does that count as a trauma? It's like, yes, it does. It's just not one of the top 10 common things that they found in the study. So if somebody answers yes to all these, it gives them an ACE score of 10, basically. Not that that's something we want to point out to people like, oh, you have a high ACE score. It's, we just know that the more trauma people have, the greater the risk is. So people aren't their ACE score. We have to, make that clear, but somebody could have an ACE score of 100. It's just from the study, again, these are just the, top 10 most common ones.
And I think that, Ivy, we've talked about this before, but because the study was done, in the 90s, the questionnaire could definitely use some updating in the time that we're living in now.
Yep. And that's kind of what this is. There's a woman, her name's Nadine Burke-Harris. And if anybody's familiar with her, she's got some TED Talks on ACEs. She's actually the Surgeon General in California now. But when she first read the ACEs study, she was a pediatrician running a clinic in kind of a lower income neighborhood and thought that we better ask these questions about children too, right? So that last survey that you just saw is for adults, filling it out on their own behalf. And this survey is actually for a parent to fill out on behalf of their child. So as you can see, like these are the top 10 ones, again, just repeated, but with further research, they've found that these are also very common and should be added, like Alexa said, to the adult version. But it's things like living in foster care, experiencing bullying has become even more of an issue, deportation or immigration, having a serious medical procedure or life-threatening illness, experiencing violence in your neighborhood or your school, and then being treated badly because of race, sexual orientation, place of birth, disability, or religion. So I'm going to just switch to the next slide that kind of shows how this breaks it down. So in the original study, they were just looking at in, the household. And that's kind of the top tier of this diagram here with the tree. But we've also learned that people can experience trauma from their environment or from their, community. So they've added in, some of these other ACEs that should be added to the list. And then on this side of the diagram, these are just some. I mean, I always say the list could go out the door, as far as the health risks that come with experiencing trauma. So these are just some of them. I won't read all of them, but as you can see, some of them are some of our top 10 like killers in the United States, like heart disease, even cancer, diabetes, can all be linked back to our early experiences in life. So we're going to watch a video here in a second that is actually from one of the key investigators. It's Vincent Felitti talking about the ACE study and how they got it going and all of that. But I just wanted to point out before I take us to that video, before we had this study, this top, these top 3 things here on this pyramid, this is kind of what people like myself, social workers, were looking at, just that, oh, people are adopting health risk behaviors. It's leading, to problems. When we're working with people, I always say, we don't want to point this out to them. We know this as, practitioners or whatever our role is, but we don't necessarily want to tell people that your high ACE score could lead to early death. That just scares people and can be triggering in itself. So instead, it's just that it leads to health risks. But before we had the study, this was our focus. But now that we've learned more about this, we know that it starts down here before we're even actually born. And it's all of these things that lead to why people are adopting, risky behavior. So I apologize for this. I tried to put this video link into the slideshow, but it will not allow me to. All the other videos won't do this, but this is going to take us out of this presentation into, is this YouTube? I don't know, PBS.
Yes, I believe.
Okay, so here we go.
The Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs study, involved asking 17,500 people if they would help us learn more about how life experiences in childhood might affect adult health and well-being decades later. The 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences that we studied were 3 of abuse, heavy-duty emotional abuse, heavy-duty physical abuse, contact sexual abuse. 2 categories of neglect, emotional neglect and physical neglect, and 5 categories of major household dysfunction.
I think what ACEs shows us is that this is not a poor person's issue. This is not a Black person's issue. This is not a single parent person issue. This is a whole big societal issue. What I am advocating is playing with a full deck of information rather than saying emptily to people, you know, shouldn't do that, it's bad for you, when they know that it's the one thing that seems to help.
We're going to pay. Where do you want to pay? Do you want to pay in more prisons and more hospitals and these kids turning around and recreating the criminal cycle? Or do you want to do something about it? And if we can take a step forward today to getting the community to understand bad things do happen and we can do something about it. But to get there, we're going to have to ask the question and we're going to have to be willing to intervene.
What we found, to our total surprise, was that simply asking, I see on the questionnaire that you were molested a number of times as a kid. How has that affected you later in your life? And listening and implicitly accepting was a very powerful form of doing.
We asked the question, how has this impacted your life? And then stopped and listened. I think what we think is that we have to do something with that, and all we have to do is really listen. Even that's powerful in itself. When we come to a place in our life that we understand that the sore has festered so much, I have to go to the doctor, that then it's time to ask for help.
Helping people speak openly about even horrific things turns out to be quite beneficial. Maybe uncomfortable for other people, but for the person involved, it's a major step in the right direction. I know that there's a lot of help that needs to happen out there. A lot of compassion, a lot of caring, a lot of, talking about this stuff.
One generation plants the trees, and the next generation enjoys the shade. If I pay today, I'm investing not only in today, but investing in tomorrow.
Okay, thanks everybody. Oops, I guess I need to close out of here. There we go.
There we go.
don't need to watch all the videos coming up. So I really like that video. I love the part where he talks about asking and listening being a profound form of doing, because I think we do kind of all get there. It's like, oh no, somebody shared this with me, I have to fix it. But when people are able to just share with somebody, they don't always need us to, point them in what they should do now. It's just, that's the beginning of somebody's healing when they're able to talk about it with somebody who's coming from a non-judgmental place who will just listen. One thing that I didn't mention on the last slide where we saw the ACE screener for the children, Nadine Burke-Harris, when she first started asking parents to fill that out on behalf of their children, she noticed a wild, difference in how many people were actually accessing services then. Just simply asking them to fill this stuff out was helping them not need to come to the doctor so many times. And one of the examples she gives in one of her TED Talks is about a little girl who was experiencing hair loss, who'd been coming in over and over again for different treatments, and nothing was really helping until the doctor sat down with mom and had her fill out the ACE questionnaire and found out, this little girl is being bullied at school. There's violence in the neighborhood. Dad had just taken off. And when the mom was given some information about how to talk to her child about that, miraculously her hair stops falling out. She was so stressed and holding it all in, it was causing hair loss. So I just point that out or give that example because that is the power of simply asking.
And Ivy, with this slide, I like to include for anybody that enjoys reading and would like to read more on this, there's a book called The Deepest Well, and I believe it's by Nadine Harris. And so if anybody wants to check that out, I've read it myself and it's very powerful, very influential.
Yeah, thanks, Alexa. Yeah, we can put that in the chat too if anybody's interested in grabbing that.
I'm just putting it in the chat real quick.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Let's see here. And so these ACEs overwhelm one's ability to cope and one's ability to integrate experiences, ideas, and emotion with life events. And with this slide, we really like to point out that perception and perspective is everything. And I like to give the example of a car accident, because two people who get into a car accident, one person can be fine, they have no problem, they just drive home, it's okay. And the other person could feel like they can't drive for a year, or they just can't drive anymore because it impacted them so severely. And so everyone experiences events differently. And so we just, as practitioners and as people that work in public health, we really need to be mindful about everybody's different perspectives, and there's nothing wrong with anyone's perspectives. They're all valid, and we just need to come from a place of a non-judgmental place and an accepting place when talking to people about trauma and what has happened to them in their lives.
Yeah, thanks, Alexa. I feel like in the ACE screener that we give people, sometimes I'll have people be like, well, this didn't traumatize me. Like for example, with the divorce, that's one of the questions. Some people might have been severely impacted by that, while another child might be like, oh, good, I'm glad there's no more, arguing anymore. So it's just letting people decide what they would like to label as trauma versus adversity, because sometimes adversity doesn't equal trauma, right? So it's just like Alexa said, just keeping that in mind when we're, in all of our interactions with everybody. So we are going to watch another video here in a minute about kind of this, but I'll just explain that, if anybody has heard of fight, flight, freeze, or the fawn response too, that's not listed, but that's kind of the tend and befriend type of fear response. But everybody has these, and it's our perception, again, of what's happening that can trigger this response in people. So obviously, if we encounter a bear, we're going to be put into this stress response of fight, flight, or freeze. But the problem with this is that, obviously we need this stress response to help us out in those situations where, our safety is in jeopardy. But the problem is that cortisol, if anybody's heard of that, it's the stress hormone that's released anytime we're in fight, flight, or freeze mode, which is beneficial because that cortisol and adrenaline are going to help us, get out of the situation. But after about 20 minutes, that cortisol becomes toxic to our system. And so when we're thinking about ACEs and why it is that, trauma can lead to these health issues, it's because of stress. It's because of that toxicity that's created in our blood when we have too much cortisol. I mean, we're not meant to run around being in fight, flight, or freeze all day. And the body doesn't really know the difference necessarily between a bear coming at us and our teacher yelling at us, or, dad coming home from work yelling and screaming around. The body's going to have the same, response to, the environment based on, our own brain chemistry and our own life experiences. So this video that I'm going to show you in a minute kind of, it talks about, I don't know if everybody's seen this before. This is kind of a popular diagram used of, it's the hand model that kind of illustrates what happens when we're in fight, flight, or freeze. They call it, I know it seems kind of cheesy, but we call it flipping our lid. So I'll go ahead and play this video. Oh, go ahead.
Ivy, real quick before you do, everybody, I have to pop off because I'm in my senior year and I do have a class at 11, but I will be here again next week. And I really enjoyed being here with you and educating you. And I hope you guys enjoy the rest of our presentation.
Thanks, Alexa.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Bye. Okay, so this next video is by Dr. Dan Siegel, and he's talking about how understanding this concept of flipping our lid can be useful for not only us, but for everybody when we teach them what's happening in the brain when we're under stress.
One of the most rewarding experiences for me has been to study brain science and apply it to the experience of parenting. And the hand model of the brain that I use to teach parents is very useful to understand that. So if you take your thumb and put it in the middle of your palm, put your fingers over the top, this is a very useful model of the brain. And when we can actually see in front of us what's going on in the brain, then we can change what the brain does. So let me walk you through very basically what happens in this brain and the structures in it. And it goes like this. The spinal cord comes up representing the wrist, and then you have coming up into the skull, the brain stem and the limbic area, which work together to help regulate arousal and your emotions and the way you have a fight, flight, freeze response. These are below the cortex, the limbic and brainstem areas, and the cortex is this higher part of the brain that allows us to perceive the outside world, to think and reason. And then this frontmost part of the brain, right behind your forehead, so the person's oriented like this, is actually the part that regulates the subcortical, limbic, and brainstem areas. This regulation is very important because sometimes we can have all sorts of things happen in our life. We're tired, we're exhausted, someone pushes a particular emotional button, and we can flip our lids. So rather than being tuned in and connected and balanced and flexible, we can lose all of that flexibility, even lose moral reasoning, and act in ways that are terrifying to others, including our children. Now, you can actually bring yourself back online and come back to the high road and make a repair with your child. And that's important to explain to them. And you can also use this hand model of the brain to explain to children, even as young as 5 and 6, how to understand when their emotions are rising up from the brainstem and limbic areas here, and how it's overriding the prefrontal area and making it so they may be about to flip their lids. So I've had kids come tell me that they're about to go flip their lids and they need a break. They need a timeout. And by even just naming that, they can tame it. And that's the power of using the hand model for ourselves and our children to help us all make sense of what goes on in the emotional communication that we have in the course of day-to-day life.
Great. So I hope everybody finds that useful. I think not only when it comes to, parenting and ourselves, it's important to remember that we can all flip our lid, even just because we're tired or stressed. But thinking about if we're, working with somebody who's had trauma, or, if we ourselves have trauma, sometimes that fear response is exaggerated. So it's easier to go from 0 to 10. And so I always say, to notice, how we're feeling, if we're starting to like clench up or, turn red, whatever it is, it's think about the hand model and how we can calm back down. Because ultimately, if we're running around like this all day, I mean, I know people or have met people who do run around, stressed out, pumping that cortisol all day long. And that is what leads to the health issues, right? So it's when we can become aware of what's happening in our body, then we can, take the deep breaths, do some self-care, which we'll, talk about later on in the presentation next week, so that we can be better able, to practice calming ourselves back down. So there's a lot of videos in this. I'm going to take you to another video that kind of gives us a little bit of, hope here about how we can actually heal from trauma. And so this is from a documentary called Healing Mean. You can actually access the whole documentary on YouTube, but this is just a little clip from it. And if anybody is here in Missoula, we are actually showing this at the Roxy Theater April 18th. So let's see, here we go. We'll play this.
80% of our population has been traumatized. The trauma is the underlying reason and the basis that leads to the self-medication, the drug use, and then eventually landing in jail. This was in 94. At this point, I was homeless, sleeping beneath a bridge, eating out of a trash can. I couldn't go in anybody's house, including my mother's. Right here I have, you can't really tell, 2 black eyes and a busted lip. Thank you for receiving us here in El Paso. My name is Tonia Kane. I was molested, I was raped, I was beaten, I was raped, and I was like, this is how it's supposed to be for me. I am nothing, I'm never gonna amount to anything, and this is how it is. And I'll stay here, I'll die just like this. And I had become comfortable with that. These 2 houses were crack houses. He brought me down here to get high with it. He said, if you don't sleep in the bus stops no more, using crack cocaine, introduced me to the criminal justice system. He thought I was trying to, I guess he thought to run off, and he thought I was resisting. So when he grabbed me, he grabbed my arm and put it behind my back and threw me against the car, which cracked my nose open. My mother had a way of, when she hit you, she would hit you with a belt, and she would hold the strap of the belt so the buckles would hit you. So we often got a lot of scars from the belt buckle.
Put that ball down.
No, you. That's what I mean.
Put that goddamn ball.
I bet you that.
I'm gonna whoop it.
I was beat, I was raped, I was hurt, I was beat. Okay, that's happening no more. But my children are still living. They're still walking this earth somewhere, and I know nothing about them. How do you heal from that? And she said, you do. What are you thankful for? Mommy! Treating my trauma totally broke that intergeneration curse. Good morning. I'm living the American dream. I'm in debt.
She now, as of yesterday, officially has become the team leader for the newly funded National Center for Trauma-Informed Care.
And I can get Why can't we keep working at it? Why can't we work at it ourselves? 83 arrests and 66 convictions. 3 times down here and multiple times in the county jail. They said I was going to spend the rest of my life in jail and die. I wasn't going to amount to anything. Not so. Not so.
Okay, so thanks everybody for watching. I know it's like the beginning of that is hard to see, But I do think the message in it is that it is so important that we heal our trauma, and that knowing that it can be done, that we can heal. That's the message of the entire documentary, actually. So I encourage everybody to watch it. It's about an hour, because there is like that message of hope. And when we're working with people, especially if they've had trauma, it's really believing, that people can heal, because we know it can be done. So I hope everybody, is feeling good. It looks like we have about 10 minutes till we'll take a break. So I'll get into a little bit of this about historical trauma, and then we can, I'll take a little breather after that. So this is what we know. We've already talked about how common ACEs are. We saw that it was, 1 in 8 people in the study had an ACE score of 4 or more, and that they are also interrelated. So I don't think I talked too much about that, but it's knowing that once we get one ACE, there's an 86% chance that we'll experience another one. And how that they're interconnected like that is just, if you think about the ACE screener, if I'm witnessing violence, either in my house or in my neighborhood, then there's my first ACE, right? Then the chance that I'm going to experience violence, or be beat up, or, experience, physical or even emotional abuse or neglect, 86% chance that I'll get the second one. So that's how they're connected. They kind of just build off of each other. And that's how it happens when people, as their health risks increase, because of, their experiences. But something that we don't always talk about necessarily is the historical trauma, or some people call it intergenerational trauma. And that, I feel like, is so important for us to know, because if you think back to that pyramid, that's where it all kind of begins. So I have people ask me all the time, like, well, how do you know that that's even real? Like, how do you know that we pass down our trauma in our DNA? So the example I always give that kind of helps people wrap their brains around it, because it is kind of, it can get pretty heady and clinical. If you're interested in reading some of that clinical, work, you can always get the book it's called The Body Keeps the Score. And they go, pretty far, in depth with that. But the simplest example I use so that people can kind of wrap their head around how this happens is about a study that they conducted with mice. And what they did was, I don't know how ethical this really is, but they would shock mice through their little cages, through the wires, through their feet. And while they did that, they would release a cherry blossom scent. So pretty soon the mice had learned, that cherry blossom equals bad, cherry blossom equals scary. So they didn't have to administer the shock anymore. They would simply release the cherry blossom scent, and all the mice would freak out, and act as if they were being traumatized. So with those mice, they took, the next generation of the little mice babies, they let them grow up into adults and did the same thing, although they still had removed the shock, right? So they didn't shock them, they just released the cherry blossom scent, and same reaction, they're all traumatized. Then again, with the third generation, same exact thing, cherry blossom equals bad, scary, stay away from it. So it took those, 2 generations to remove, that trauma response from the DNA. So when we think about that, that just means that we could be walking around today with our grandparents' trauma, and maybe even further back than that, because what they found is we have to get rid of that initial shock, right? If they had kept shocking those generations of mice, it would have kept, passing down. They had to remove the shock value for the cherry blossom equals bad, to be out of the DNA. And the reason, it's passed down is because it's a survival mechanism. We want our offspring to know, what to avoid or stay away from, or what's harmful, or what could, potentially lead to death, so that they avoid it. So that's why it, is passed down in our DNA. So where are we at for time here? Okay, still got some minutes. So this is just one example of historical trauma that we're going to listen to here in a minute. But we just know that historical trauma can impact, generations upon generations. It's not something that just goes away, because the shock hasn't gone away necessarily. So I'm going to play for you a clip. I actually had a friend record this for me. I used to read it, but it's a lot. So if everybody wants to, again, just kind of ground yourself, take a deep breath. This is a little clip about the Native American experience from one of the tribes. So I'll go ahead and play it. Hopefully you guys can hear this.
Each year, members of the Lakota tribe and their allies gather in Bridger, South Dakota, and travel more than 300 kilometers on horseback in the dead of winter. The conditions are harsh. Wind and snow burn their faces and make it difficult to breathe. They travel to commemorate the journey of their ancestors. After the killing of Chief Sitting Bull by the U.S. Cavalry, Chief Bigfoot led approximately 350 Lakota, mostly women and children, on what he hoped would be a journey to the safety of the Pine Ridge Reservation. Instead, they were intercepted by the U.S. Army. Their group submitted peacefully and made camp along Wounded Knee Creek. On the morning of December 29th, 1890, a shot rang out and chaos ensued. Those who tried to flee were pursued and executed by U.S. soldiers. Children who hid were coaxed to come out and then were killed. All told, more than 250 Lakota were massacred. Although this tragedy took place more than 100 years ago, its impact remains. The ongoing pain from the genocide of the Lakota and numerous other acts against Native American communities has been described as a soul wound. It is what drives the Lakota horse riders in their search for both personal and communal healing. The past weaves intricately through modern life, and in some ways, communities are still trying to recover.
So yeah, I know, again, another deep breath for everybody, because that's a lot to hear. But again, I think it's important that we all hear these stories and listen to the truth of, how this has impacted different communities and groups, because this does still live on today. We still have racism. We still have a lot of inequity. And I think, talking about it as a soul wound is the perfect way to describe it, because that is how deep it goes, how deep the pain is. So it can't be those conversations of like, oh, that didn't happen to you. That was, like they say in this, 100 years ago, 300 years ago. It still lives on. When you read the book, The Body Keeps the Score, it talks about that cell memory of, even if we can't recall it necessarily in our memory, we feel it. So this slide down here shows, all the different terms that it's been kind of coined. This one here is a little different. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. It says slavery, it's actually supposed to be slave syndrome, but I don't know if we have time to watch. Maybe we'll take a break now, and then I put in a clip. I actually just added this to this presentation because when I was doing this for other groups, I would get so many questions on what is this? What is post-traumatic slave syndrome? People haven't heard of it. There's actually a book written about it. One of the doctor who you'll see in the video did all the research. It's her theory of what happens or how slavery has affected people today. So is that okay with you, Emily and Amy, if we take a little break and come back? Should we do 5 minutes, 10 minutes?
Maybe 10. I think that sounds
10?
good.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. I think we probably still have like another minute. I thought I would jump back on, but I see that I have some messages here. If you wrote me a message in the chat, I promise I will get back to you here with your questions. I also can give everybody my email address. I'm so happy to talk with people one-on-one. I know that this training does, when we start to learn this information, it stirs up a lot of things for people. So I'm so happy to, talk with people one-on-one or set up, meeting or consultation or even more information that I can provide or even referrals if need be. So yeah. But has it been 10 minutes here, Emily? I tried to set my timer, but I might have set it a little early or late.
Emily ran to the bathroom, but yes, it's been just about 10 minutes.
Okay, great. Well, let's see. I will go to the next slide here. Oop. Okay, so hopefully everybody's back with us. Again, this video is about, it kind of breaks down. There's a lot more to it, but I felt like this is a really helpful just video. It's 5 minutes, so it's our longest video. And I think this is the last video I have for today. So I apologize with all the videos. Sometimes I feel like people enjoy them and other people are like, not another one of these. So, but this one I really love because I feel like because most people haven't heard of post-traumatic slave syndrome, this gives us just one clear example of how this, breaks down for the African American experience, in today's life. So I'll go ahead and play this. Okay, good. Thanks. Somebody told me they're enjoying the video. So good. I think that this video, especially because so many people haven't heard of it, it gives a clear picture of what this is. And if you haven't heard of it, that's okay, because I'll admit I hadn't even heard of this for probably I think it's been maybe a year and a half since I even heard this term. So yeah, you're not alone if you haven't ever heard of this before, but it's so important that we all know. So, okay, here it goes.
Post-traumatic slave syndrome is an explanatory theory that really looks at multi-generational trauma. One of the things that's difficult for people is their first response is, oh my God, that happened so long ago. We're talking about people being captured, shipped, sold, beaten, raped, experimented on. And then you have to ask the question, did the trauma continue? Yes. So 300 years of trauma, no help, freed, no help, more trauma. If it's a sustained trauma, then the impact of that is also sustained. When we look at multi-generational trauma, we're looking at people who are maybe victims of natural disasters and their families and their children, and generations of folks who have experienced war. And we know that there are residual mental, emotional, traumatic impact. And what I did was I started to look at the African-American experience, starting with slavery as a real clear, long enduring traumas. I started to see that there were clear connections between that survival behavior and contemporary living in African-American experience. I started to see common behaviors that I took for granted as, well, cultural. There's adaptive behaviors, survival behaviors. Well, what are they? Let's just say 2019, you have a Black mother and a white mother. The sons go to school together. They find themselves at a meeting. The Black mother leans over to the white mother and says, I just wanted to mention to you that I noticed that your son is really doing quite well. And the white mother's response is, oh, thank you. She begins to go on and on about, he won the science fair, his uncle's an astronaut. She's just oozing. She realizes the Black mother's son is actually excelling her son. And she says, well, wait a minute. Your son's the one that's really coming along. And the Black mother responds, oh my God, he's a handful, but oh, he just works my nerves. Now, when I'm working with African-American people, it doesn't matter what the audience is. It doesn't matter what class. If I were to ask, is she very proud while she's saying those denigrating things? And everybody laughs and goes, of course, there's a secret. Because everybody Black knows that even though the Black mother is going, oh my God, she's really proud. So now let's roll that scene back 300 years. And let's say this Black mother is working in the fields And a white slave owner comes through and says, wow, that boy is really coming along. What is she gonna say? No, he's not. He's stupid. He's shiftless. He can't work because I don't want you to sell him. So I denigrate them to protect them. That is called appropriate adaptation when living in a hostile environment. The little white boy, say Timmy, you know, he feels really comfortable and happy about what his mom just said about him. And Trey looks at his mom and wonders, why can't you be proud of me? Because he doesn't understand the secret yet. And by the time he learns the secret, he will have already been injured by it. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. PTSD is a disorder that occurs as a result of a single trauma. You don't even have to be there to actually get a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. You could just hear about something horrific happening to someone you love. So you have people who have experienced it firsthand, people who have witnessed it in their environment, right? People who are continuing to be oppressed. That exacerbates any possibility of healing. So it's not post-traumatic stress disorder, because then it becomes part of what we call your socialization process. So you begin to normalize a way of living and being, everything from what we eat to what we believe it means to be a friend. You know, all of these things are colored by history. And if you don't understand it, you're going to fold in things that you've just assumed are normal. But post-traumatic stress disorder, you know, exaggerated startle response, outbursts of anger, feeling of foreshortened future. There was a point where there were, you know, African-American children in different urban settings that didn't expect to live to be adults because they saw so much death, that they started planning their funerals like at 13, 12, as young as 10. When you start looking at the simple biology, you start looking at the impact of stress on health. And while we look at general stress, you know, we know finances, you have illnesses, all these different things. How about being Black? How does factoring in being Black in America impact your stress level and therefore your body's ability to operate its own immune system? Because we know it compromises the immune system. Once you understand it, then you can deal with it. Because you see, it's habitual. You socialize. It becomes part of your being. So one of the ways you begin to address that multi-generational trauma is to work with the people it directly impacts, to hear from them. And when you give the people the information, they can use it. I think the first order of business is beginning to have a conversation. And the other is to educate the larger society. You have to stop the assault. So this is not purely a clinical thing. This requires social justice and change. That's where part of the healing is. It's not in a clinical setting or in a pill. It's in fairness and justice and safety and equity. We got to work with some of those clinical things, some of those issues of panic and anxiety. And we also have to deal with the fact that you have a system that is set up to oppress you and to continue to injure you. Both those things have to be dealt with. And they cannot singularly by themselves affect a change. They have to be done collectively. Post-traumatic.
So I hope everybody enjoyed that video. I felt like that breaks it down. It's one of the more clear because it's coming from the person who actually coined that term and knows the most about it. But I really like, you know, what she says in there about giving people, you know, once people have the information, then they can use it. You know, if people aren't aware of this, then there isn't a, you know, beginning place. We have to be able to name something in order to, you know, move forward. It's kind of like when we think about our emotions, if I can't name what I'm feeling, whether it's, you know, angry or depressed or, you know, anxious, then how do I work through it? Right. So I think that's the power of this knowledge that we have, that we can keep learning more and more about, and, you know, keep spreading it, because it isn't about, like she said at the end of the video, just one person, you know, healing all the trauma for themselves. There, it has to be, you know, there has to be this collaboration where we're fixing, you know, those systemic issues that she was talking about with the, you know, the equity. Yeah, thanks for putting that in there. I think I love her. I think if you guys want to, you know, read more about it, I highly recommend her book. It's just called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And she talks about all the effects that it can have on communities. of color. So this next slide, I know this is another hard one to look at. We call it another pandemic because even though this isn't new, this has been going on forever, even before, COVID, it's still happening, right? So we could classify this as, a pandemic, racial injustice. And this is just one simple example of how this happens every day. So this is from 2005, but it shows, the differences in how we use implicit bias to harm people, even if it's unintentional. So the captions, as you can see, here, it's, two white people, but they found, bread and soda. And then here, this little boy, he's looting, right? So this is how it continues to happen in our society, in our culture, because if you think back to my example about the mice, this is a shock. If somebody's reading this comparing these, this, just shows that shock hasn't gone away. So when we think back to, the video of like slavery being 300-400 years ago, we're still shocking people with the things even they see in the news, with police brutality, and also even just hearing the N-word. That wasn't long ago that the N-word was spray painted on the locker rooms here at one of the high schools. It's just like, this is when we think about why it's not going away, that's, it's because we continue, to harm people with that shock value. So I always love this quote. This is why we need to have this information. One doesn't have to operate with great malice to do great harm. The absence of empathy and understanding is sufficient. And if you've ever heard of Charles M. Blow, I love him. He actually writes for the New York Times, a lot of articles about racial justice. And I think this quote just sums it up. This is why we learn this information and grow our empathy and understanding, because otherwise even if it's unintentional, we're causing harm or, continuing that shock. Okay, so re-traumatization, that's what's happening when we, get the shock over and over again. Well, if you look up the word re-traumatization, it's actually like not, I was trying to look it up. I'm like, that's not even in the dictionary in some places, but it is a term, and it's basically a situation, attitude, interaction, or environment that can replicate, an event or the dynamics of an event that led, to a trauma. And it can be obvious, like seeing the N-word, that's, an obvious form of re-traumatization. Or it can be sometimes not so obvious, like who knows who wrote those news articles that we, the captions that we just saw. Maybe that was, unintentional, or could have just been their implicit bias coming through. So maybe it wasn't so obvious to them. Looking at it, I'm like, that is obvious. But for the person who wrote it, maybe they weren't thinking about it. Another example of how it could be not so obvious would be, let's say I'm working with a client. I think that we need a little bit of privacy. So I bring them in my office and shut the door, right? Without asking them, like, should we shut this? Do you want it open? Or how's the lighting in here? Like, would you want to sit out here, go outside? It's giving some options. If I just am like, let's go, we're shutting the door, to somebody who maybe has been abused behind closed doors, that can be a trigger, right? But if I'm not aware of this or thinking about it, it's not so obvious to me, but it's going to be very obvious to the person I'm working with. So yeah, it's usually unintentional. I like to give people the benefit of the doubt. It's not that we're like trying to re-traumatize people, but it's, again, if we're not trauma informed, if we haven't heard this information or talked about it and we don't know what to do, it's going to be harmful, right? So that's what this says down here. Even if it's unintentional, it's always hurtful, right? So I think even though, this term isn't necessarily out there, I think we always need to be mindful of how we can avoid, re-traumatizing people in, situations. And this goes for everybody. Again, I think sometimes we think, oh, this is just for the people that we work with, but it's also, for everybody we come into contact with, especially if we're not sure if somebody's had trauma or not. It's better to just treat everybody as if maybe there's some trauma. I'm not going to like sneak up behind somebody, or be in their personal space too much. It's those little things that we're going to talk more about next week too, like the guiding principles of how to be trauma informed so we avoid this. So this is just an example of how this is set up in our systems. Our systems are set up to not be very helpful. So the example I give with this, I'll just talk about these top two things for time's sake, but with this one, having to continually retell our story, a perfect example of that is going to the doctor. I think we all have had that experience where you have to call, and tell them what's going on, and then, set up your appointment, get there and wait forever, fill out paperwork with all your information. And then you're called back into the waiting room. There's more waiting, then the nurse will come in and ask you to talk about, what you filled out on your paperwork. And then they leave the room, right? Then you wait around for the doctor. You think maybe they're talking about my chart or my paperwork, but instead the doctor will come back in and ask you, to just share everything you already said. And that's the system, right? It's set up that way. So for somebody who, doesn't have trauma, or doesn't have this kind of core belief going on, it's just, mildly irritating or annoying. Be like, don't they talk to each other, or can't they just read my chart? So that, is just a light example for somebody who, doesn't have that trauma history or those core beliefs of not being seen or heard. But for somebody who does have that, it's going to impact the services they receive. If that was me, I'd be like, this is just frustrating. I'm not coming back here again, or I'm not going to go see the doctor again because they don't care about me anyway. Right? That's the problem with not taking a look at these systems and how they can best serve people, how we can be more trauma informed and responsive, because we want people to reach out and get, the care that they need, rather than it be a situation where, it's a barrier, or it puts us back into that cycle of trauma of like, yep, this confirms my belief that, they don't care about me here, so I'm not coming back. Okay. And yep, this is what I was talking about, the cycle of trauma. This is how it works, that it's the actual event happens and it gives us, this sense of worthlessness, and then often we will engage in behaviors that aren't healthy for us. An example of that might be like smoking. That's just a simple example, but people know that smoking is bad for us. But when we also know that nicotine directly impacts the brain and causes a calming response, why would somebody give that up if they don't have any other resources, right? Another example might be, a exaggerated, like anger response to a situation where it's like, whoa, that you shouldn't have been that angry about it. But for somebody who's, having these core beliefs, be put back into place because of, an event that happened that replicated the trauma, they can sometimes act negatively, in ways that with the, the anger response that we might not think is deserved, or that they shouldn't be acting that way. So then we respond in a way to them. Like, I think you've probably all heard this when people are like, you need to calm down. That doesn't work for people. And it just confirms again, these beliefs that we have, like, oh, great, now I can't go to that person anymore either. And then we're back into the, just goes back to the initial event again. So this is why we want to avoid the re-traumatization and even those scenarios that I talked about, at the doctor's office, because if we don't really take a look at it, this is where people are going to continue to stay, right? They're not going to access services that might be helpful in healing or, building coping strategies, because it's confirming, this belief that the world isn't safe, people aren't safe, people don't care about me. So hopefully we can get through all this. I know we might not. I'm looking at the time. It's almost 11:30 and I want to end about 15 minutes early, 10-15 minutes early for questions or comments. But we put in some information about COVID. If we don't get through all the COVID information, we can just pick up with it next week before we talk about those guiding principles for trauma-informed care. But let's see how far we can get through this. So I think we all know this, that this, it's quickly become, a global health emergency that has led to physical and psychological concern. So right now, there's a lot of information about this as far as trauma being, or COVID being considered, a traumatic experience for people. There haven't been, because it's so new, there haven't been studies about it, but I think we can all predict that this has been a traumatic time for a lot of people, and maybe not everybody, but it has changed the way that our lives, are working and or not working. So I think it's important to just recognize that people that we're, living with or working with, people in our lives may feel, again, when we go back to like the perception of trauma and how it's the way somebody perceives it as something as traumatic or not is important. And so we don't want to deny the fact that people may feel, that COVID has traumatized them. So as we're working with people, or even for ourselves, these are the things that need to be in place, right? I think we've gotten a little bit better at this now that we're kind of like seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. But it's just thinking, if people don't have all of these things in place, they're going to be at a higher risk for feeling the effects, of COVID in maybe a traumatic way. I don't think I need to, explain what each of these things is. But I actually got this from a different study. There have been a few, like a little bit of research around this. It's not an actual, like published study on trauma and COVID, but we know that these are the stressors, that people are experiencing. So, if we just think about it, we all probably can relate to this right now. It's like, yep, we all, I had to quarantine, or I had to stay home with my kids because they had to quarantine. This social isolation is really hard for people who are social in their everyday lives. So learning how to do all of it, even like these Zoom things, is hard for people. So keeping that in mind. And then obviously we know that loss of income or employment has affected people. This one I found out firsthand. I mean, I have a 13-year-old, so he's more, self-sufficient, and I could work at home more easily with him. But I would try to help out friends and have their littler kids come over. And yeah, I will say that was a stressor. So I feel for y'all that have little ones, that they're like, I need a snack, and, hopping on your Zoom calls with you. So again, these are just, general ones that most people have experienced. I will say with this, making difficult medical decisions, including vaccinations, I put that in here because I read an interesting article about why people are refusing the vaccine or have so much distrust around it. And it was a small study. I think there were like maybe, I can't remember if it was like 70 people only, but a majority of them said or replied that they had a history of trauma. So it's again, when we think even of that video of the post-traumatic slave syndrome, when people have generations of being like experimented on and, that passed down throughout generations, obviously they might have a little, like distrust of the medical world. So I think that was enlightening to me because I was wanting to be like, why the heck wouldn't you get a vaccine? but when we think about it and educate, people around it, it's more helpful than just being like, you're stupid and need to get vaccinated. So it's, again, I mean, these are all the, things that most people are experiencing, and they might even find these traumatic, right? It's, again, somebody's perception, but we do know that these things are traumatic for people, right? Obviously, if you or someone is severely ill, hospitalized, or we've witnessed a death, or heard about it, or we have extreme exposure to COVID details, that I think about, especially for people working in the COVID, like incident, doctors, nurses. I know some people put in here that they're in investigation. When we hear these details every single day, or even if we're reading it in the news a lot, it can start to feel really heavy and overwhelming. So one thing that they found is that these exposures, especially when they're like over and over again, can increase our risk for developing PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So everybody's probably familiar with this term. It was mostly thought about in soldiers, returning from combat or war, but they've now found that really anybody can, experience PTSD. And these are just some of I know this is like all over the place with all of these different symptoms that might come from PTSD. But I think it's important to remember too, like from the video of the post-traumatic slave syndrome video, that people don't have to always experience something directly in order to develop PTSD. It's, again, we can hear about it, or, just even witness it happening to somebody else to develop this. So just keeping that in mind. And with COVID, how this relates to COVID is that what they found is that the more and more, trauma exposures we have, they sometimes call it, our lifetime trauma load, can result in PTSD. So with COVID, having all of these things happen, and then also having a history of it, it just, increases our chances. It doesn't mean that if I have a history of trauma already, and now I'm, in this pandemic and things are stressful, that I'm going to have PTSD. But I think it's, again, helpful to know that our chance of developing it is increased. So what can we do about that? Right? It's a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about next week too, is like just the basic, self-care, taking care of our needs, always doing that self-reflection and getting, the help that we need to meet our needs. So I put this in here about grief and loss because, again, when we're talking about perception, even if somebody doesn't necessarily coin the term, it's like, I'm traumatized. Grief and loss kind of have the same, feelings. So with this pandemic going on, and I know a lot of us are working with the public and probably have clients or, family and friends that are experiencing grief and loss, it's just important to be mindful, about that this is going on, so that we can react to people in, a trauma-informed way. I mean, I like this in here, even just, the changes to our daily routine can be very upsetting for people, and children too. And so this is just, a list of things that, people are experiencing, but it's knowing that when these things are compounded, like happening all at the same time, it's then exacerbating the issue, right? If all of these things are happening, you can see why somebody, would be flipping their lid, so it's just, again, being aware that while we're working with people, this stuff could be going on, kind of on the back burner that they're not talking about, because I don't think a lot of people are having this conversation, right, of how COVID could be seen as traumatic to many people. So I wanted to put this in here too, just some of the effects on children. This is mainly focused on adolescents because what they're finding is that kids, you know, 6th, 7th grade into high school, it's harder for us to identify, you know, like how they're dealing with grief loss related to the pandemic, and also even just with other, you know, traumatic experiences or stressful experiences, because from this list, you can kind of see it's like, you know, kids, significant change in their sleep patterns. It's like, I know, you know, teens start to sleep more, you know, they need like 10 hours a night, but so sometimes we might overlook some of these things, you know. Also teens are like, get out of my room, I don't want to hang out with you, mom, you know. So we're like, okay, they're just being a teen. I don't know who, if anybody has a teen, but they can be irritable and frustrated, right? So it's, again, just being aware, you know, and talking to them, having conversations about how they're feeling, helping them develop healthy coping strategies is all important, so that, you know, we're better able to see if something is kind of going on under the surface and not just disregard it as like, oh, that's just normal teen behavior. I mean, some of these are a little more evident, you know, if they start using, you know, drugs and alcohol, and haven't ever in the past, you know, there's obviously something going on. So I always say, you know, if we notice any of these things, we're trying to open up and talk to them about it. They're not doing it. It's always a good thing, you know, to access mental health services. I think there's still kind of this, you know, kind of stigma around mental health. Like, I don't need to see a counselor, I don't need a therapist. Like, how dare you say that to me? So keeping that in mind too, when working with people, it can be triggering for people to be told that therapy might be helpful, but it really is. You know, I feel like everybody should have therapy, you know, at some point in their life, or a lifelong therapist, right? It's not a bad thing. So helping to, you know, reduce that stigma. So I got this from the CDC. We're at 11:40, so I'll try to go for just 5 more minutes. Because people were asking, you know, like, well, what are we supposed to do? Like, how are we supposed to, you know, deal with this with our children? And honestly, what the CDC says is just model like the behavior, you know, practice being calm, practice getting your needs met, which we'll talk more about next week, because sometimes it's hard to identify what all of our needs are and if we are even getting them met. But the more confident we feel in handling stress and with our own, you know, coping mechanisms too, our children and everybody, actually, it's not just children, is going to see that, and we can model it. Okay, so these are just some tips in here on, you know, how we can support our clients or patients in the pandemic. So I think a lot of people, I read this article here and people were kind of like, oh, great. You know, we're already stressed out. We have less time, resources, energy, like just adding more things to my to-do list, you know, that we don't have time for. But if we look at it in a way of like, well, it's just simple little things that we can do. It doesn't mean we have to spend a whole, you know, extra hour with people talking about how they're doing with the pandemic. It's just some simple little tips I put in here to make sure that we're not, you know, making appointments longer with people. But just doing a brief little emotional check-in with them, like, how are you doing? You know, talk about their mood. If they're feeling anxious, try to normalize that this is hard for a lot of people. That's why you're just bringing it up to check in. If anybody has done a motivational interviewing training, that's always great because it helps empower people to set their own goals and, you know, talk about themselves. So I always recommend, you know, the motivational interviewing. If we're working with kids, it's just using, you know, appropriate language for them. You know, we want to scare little kids. So it's just, you know, making sure that we're saying the word like germs rather than like a vaccine, you know, or the virus, because they don't understand, you know, those things. So I like this one too. Just point out that point out to caregivers and the children what they're doing, you know, to give them a little praise and keeping their kids safe. And then with this one, if you don't already have a list, we're going to talk more about this next week too. of high quality referrals, or community referrals, try to start building one. If somebody comes to you and when you ask them about something like this, and they tell you like, yep, have really unhealthy coping strategies, where can we refer them? Even if it's just like a website too, but having actual, practitioners that we know are reputable and have the skills that this person, might need, giving them a few choices too is really important. And then always, follow up with them the next time. It's like, I remember last time we talked about this, how you doing now? Just checking in. People really appreciate that. I think we all feel good, when somebody's like, I've been thinking about you. It's like, oh, right. So it's just these simple little tips that help people build trust, with us, and will, hopefully open up about how they're doing. And then this engaging patients and shared decision making, that kind of goes back to the motivational interviewing. It's just making sure that we're giving them a voice and a choice. We're not just like, what you need to do is get more sleep and eat better diet. That doesn't necessarily help people. They're like, I know I do. So it's, making sure that they have the voice, they're making the decisions, as it can be, related. Okay, where are we at for time? Got a couple minutes. I'll do this slide and then we can open it up to questions and comments. So it's for us as well as providers. This is a lot, if you're hearing a lot of, information day after day that people are telling you, even if it's not about COVID necessarily, maybe it's just, trauma related, it can, burn us out, cause, stress, fatigue. We can also experience, trauma related to hearing our clients, our friends or families, even stories. So it's just knowing that I like this, if there was ever a time to consider using, therapy, even if we're a therapist, or work in mental health, it's a great time to access services for ourselves too. And knowing, I've talked to some people, they're like, well, the system is already, like overloaded. There aren't even enough therapists out there. I can't even, get into a therapist, or I can't take on more clients even because everybody's busy. So I don't want to, overwork an already, overloaded system. So I always just, want to tell people, like, don't worry about, feeling like you're going to bombard, the mental health services that other people are needing. We matter too, and if our cup's not full, it's again, that little analogy of like, if our cup isn't full, we can't pour into anybody else's. So we do need to, be looking out for ourselves too, and checking in, and take time off if you need it, talk to people, friends, family. It doesn't always necessarily have to be a therapist, but we do need to have those trusted people in our lives to talk about this stuff, because it is understandable and kind of like this says expected to happen, because this is a lot, it's a hard, challenging time. Okay, so let's end with this. And then because we're at 11:45, and I can open it up to questions, comments. And then next week, we'll talk about all of this, how this impacts. We'll just pick up with this slide, these different levels. And then we'll go more into what to do about it. What are those guiding principles? What can we change so that we can more effectively work with people and invite people in to, access services where they, feel safe and cared about. And then we're also going to do some more stuff with the self-care, which I promise won't be your like normal self-care thing where people are like, oh, not this again. I think it's good. So, okay, I'll stop sharing this. Great. So does anybody have any questions or comments for me as far as any of the material goes?
Do we know? Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Do we know the mechanism of ancestral trauma, like how it's actually passed from one person to the other and one generation to the other? Like, is it a physical mechanism, like a genetic mechanism, or is it?
Yep, it actually changes our DNA so that when we pass it down, you know, it's kind of, it's stored, you know, in our reproductive organs actually. So it's very, yeah, it's interesting, but I would recommend, yeah, definitely checking out that book, because they do kind of like the clinical breakdown of how this happens, that, you know, I'm not necessarily the best expert to explain the science behind it. But yeah, it's basically a survival, you know, mechanism. That's why the DNA is changed, so that we can pass that down, you know, to next generations, to keep them safe, to keep, you know, them alive. So sorry, that's not like the best answer, but I appreciate that question. Anybody else have a comment, question, anything they feel like was a good takeaway that they'll be able to even like use starting even today? Maybe I can address some of the questions I got earlier, talking about, you know, if we know that we have a history of abuse, you know, or trauma in our family, what do we do about it, right? Because sometimes families don't talk about it, especially if they don't have this information. You know, it's easier for us to avoid it, you know, put it under the rug, because we don't want to usually like burden anybody. That's kind of the response I get. It's like, well, I didn't want to like put my stuff on somebody else, so I just kept it to myself. So I think it can be challenging if we know that there's like a history of this, but we're not exactly sure of like the details around it. I think sometimes when we start educating people, we can get them to open up and talk to us about it. But ultimately, people aren't going to share, you know, if they're not ready to. And we can't, you know, when we learn about being trauma informed, we can't make people share their stories. That might actually be, you know, re-traumatizing to them. So I always encourage, you know, sometimes you can start a conversation, especially if it's with family members, to talk about or share some of this information that you've had, and let them know, you know, that this is very common, that type of thing, and what we can do to heal. But again, if people aren't ready to talk about it, I think even just knowing, even if we don't know the details, even just knowing that, you know, yep, I probably have some, you know, historical trauma going on in my family, we can still take steps to heal, because we've already acknowledged, you know, like, well, this has probably happened. And again, I always recommend, you know, they're like finding a therapist who is trauma informed, and making sure that they have those credentials, and, you know, opening up and talking to them about it if we need to build more coping strategies too. I also think, you know, the more we read about it and educate ourselves can help us with that as well. So I hope that answered the question that somebody had sent me. Someone asked, let's see. Oh, let's see. I need to get back up here. Someone wondered if there were any recommendations for videos or websites. I will actually, shoot, I should put that slide up for you guys. I have a list of like resources that I always recommend for people to actually go there. Let's see. Let me share my screen again here. And then people can write this down to learn more about I'll get this up for you guys. Did I put it in here? Oh, here we go. So this is just more information, you know, to learn about like the study. And how working more with trauma-informed care. I think definitely going to this this website, this is where a lot of the information came from. But yeah, if you guys want to take a little screenshot of this, I don't know if you guys got the slides, like I said, but I can send those to you too.
This group hasn't received the slides yet, but I can send them after this and then make sure, and then they'll have them for the second half next week.
Oh, great. Okay. I think, Emily, the slides that I sent you for the previous one are a little bit different. They're all,
okay.
it's all the same information. It's just, I moved a few of the videos sooner. So I can
if you don't mind resending me an updated one.
Yep.
That'd be great. And I can send it out.
Yep. Perfect. Okay. So I hope everybody got that. Let's see what else was in the chat here. More information about cortisol and the effects on the body. Yeah, I mean, there's especially during fight, flight, or freeze, that I don't have an actual, I mean, I'm pretty sure it's probably in some of these websites too, but oops, it's just knowing, let me stop sharing this. I don't know where my little search bar went. Oh, well. Okay, sorry, everybody. I don't know what happened to that, but I'll just put this up for you guys so you don't have to stare at that. Okay, sorry, lost my train of thought there. So cortisol effects on the body, it's not that cortisol necessarily is bad for us. It's just that our body isn't designed to be in, panic or survival mode all the time. So when we think about the little flipping of the lid, the reason why it affects the body, in a negative way is that when we have that stress pumping through our system, we're in fight, flight, freeze, right? And when we're calm like this, we're in rest, digest. That's kind of, the flip side of our nervous system, fight, flight, freeze, rest, digest. If our body never has a chance to calm down or live here, this is where we like to live, right? The reason why, it impacts our health so greatly is because it's impacting then our immune system. If we never have a chance to rest, recuperate, recover, we're not getting enough sleep. If we're in fight, flight, freeze, our digestion is going to be all over the place. We think about cortisol being toxic to the system after 20 minutes. It's, cortisol is pumped through our bloodstream. It goes to all of our systems, right? So that's how it leads to some, potential even diseases, because it's connected to all of our, organs, even, our skin, all of that can be affected by too much stress. So I hope that kind of answers that question. The cortisol connection. Oh, good. Thanks for putting that in there. Why stress makes you fat and ruins your health and what you can do about it. Great. Yeah. Thanks for putting that in here. I think I actually haven't read that, so I'm going to definitely check that out. I think when we talk about, like storing fat, it's, it has been shown that it's again, because it's affecting, our digestive system, right? Because if we're always in stress mode, we're not really, able to digest food that much. I mean, stress is, I always say it's just the #1 killer because it's connected to the top 10 diseases that we have here in the States. We put the title's a little heavy, but the book isn't. Thanks for that. I'm definitely going to check that out. The COVID loves fat in people. Interesting. Haven't heard that. I think maybe, that's why they talk about some of those health risks, people who might be obese are more affected by the virus. So that would be interesting to look into. Well, great. We have about 4 minutes. We're almost at noon. I appreciate everybody being here today and talking about this. I think it's quite a lot. Oops. And I think if everybody can today make sure you do some of your self-care, you know, because just even hearing a lot of this, I think it stirs things up. So doing something to decompress, even if it's just 10 minutes, you know, spending some time outside, whatever it is that fills your cup, making sure that, you know, we're putting the time in for us, you know, because that is ultimately, you know, number one. If we're not, you know, looking out for ourselves, it's really hard to like be in this work, you know, be giving to others. So thank you everybody for, you know, putting the comments in the chat, saying thank you. I enjoyed doing this today. I'm looking forward to next week too. I think it's kind of the meat of the presentation of, you know, now we know what trauma is and how it affects people. So how do we put it into practice in our daily lives a little bit more? So yeah, looking forward to that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ivy. I love this information, getting it out there. I'm looking forward to next week as well. Like I said, if you can get me the latest slides, I'll make sure that that's sent out to everyone. I thought you said wait, not great. I'm like, yes.
Oh, no. Wait, no.
So thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciated the engagement and the questions as well. That certainly helps and keeps it really interesting. You guys bring up wonderful points and resources and wonderful questions. So thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah, have a great rest of the day.